Okay, so my name is Cassidy Cousens, and in the last video we talked about the basics to conducting an intervention. And where we left off was how you could support the treatment process once the intervened on went to treatment. And almost inevitably, there's going to be some fracture between the treatment center and the intervened on client. And I think to fully comprehend the challenges that you're going to be faced with, it's important for me to explain to you a little bit where I come from, what my thought philosophy is, and my background. So essentially, I've been working in the field for about 15 years. And when I first started, I was in a nonprofit program. So the program that I was working for was large, 110, 120 people, and it was completely funded by charitable donations. So virtually everybody that was in this facility was there for free. And I think that there's a sense that, if you don't pay for treatment, or if there's such a heartfelt obligation on the side of the facility, that the participants, the people that are in the program, would be very open-minded to the process of recovery and the information that was being given to them. And interestingly enough, as time went on and I ended up working in the high-end for-profit sector and then eventually started my own program, the truth is that in every different aspect of the treatment field that I've worked in, from intervening, which is like a private enterprise where you're sort of going out as an individual and helping families get their loved ones into a treatment center, and treatment centers that were sponsored by charitable organizations, and treatment centers that people paid excessive amount of money to go to, and the programs that I operate today, there are similarities in the client population across the board. And as much as you might want to, as a family member or a loved one, examine the facility in somehow being complicit with the success or the lack of success that your loved one is going to experience or is experiencing, there's some real basic information about how you can approach the treatment process that I'm going to share with you from the standpoint of observing addictive pathology over the last 15 years. So when I was working in the nonprofit sector, which by the way is somewhat of a myth, right? So if you think about the nonprofit sector, I think some of the standout programs would be Betty Ford, I think Hazelden's nonprofit, and then there's a few other agencies sort of spattered around the country in the United States that are nonprofit on paper. And in truth, a lot of these programs cost $20, $30, $40, $50,000 to go to, but they're nonprofit. And the first thing to recognize is that you've already chosen a facility. So at the end of the day, hopefully that vetting process for you was one where you investigated the modality. Hopefully you had the resources to investigate the modality made sense to you, the method of treatment made sense to you, and you've chosen a treatment center based on its ability to meet your loved one's needs. The truth is that no matter whether you have or you haven't, there's going to be some pretty consistent behaviors that are going to come up during the treatment process. So going back to working in the not-for-profit sector, there was no question that the people that were there definitely should have had an attitude of gratitude. So they're not paying for treatment. This happened to be one of the nonprofits that, at the end of the day, was really about doing the right things. And unfortunately, the clients often exhibited a lack of gratitude, a sense of entitlement. They were resistant to the process. They didn't follow recommendations. They argued with staff. I mean, all the same things that you get when you have, quote unquote, a paying customer who's going to a high-end facility in Malibu or Florida and believes on some level that because they're paying, they should dictate the terms of treatment. And fundamentally, that existence, that resistance in each addict, alcoholic, gambler, person that's struggling with eating disorders is a fabric of the ability, or inability rather, to let go of the addiction itself. And to understand why that's happening, it's important to comprehend what addiction is doing. So one of the first things that you can do to support the treatment process is to understand how addiction and how addictive pathology and how self-destructive behaviors, all these sort of things that you've been witnessing in your loved one, are serving that. And it's important to recognize that it may be self-destructive, and at the end of the day it may even be fatal. But the truth is that the person who's suffering from this affliction sees it on the other side. And so the other side, how it serves them, is it potentially prevents, distracts, and relieves pain. Okay? So these rituals, these behaviors, these patterns, this way of being distracts them from pain, relieves them from pain. It anesthetizes the internal discomfort that they're experiencing. Now, from a medical clinical standpoint, there might be no question at all that your loved one has some sort of underlying psychological or psychiatric issue, that they've been essentially self-medicating. They could be bipolar, they could be depressed, they could be anxious, they could have sleep cycle disturbances, there could be any number of different things that are happening neurochemically that are causing them to try to subconsciously self-medicate that symptomology. The challenge is that no matter whether there was a pre-existing condition or not, depending on the severity of the addictive process, that's the first line of treatment. Without eradicating the priority list, without eradicating the seriousness of the addiction, there's virtually no way to treat these underlying factors because they usually take more time to treat, and the treatment is ongoing. So the resistance that you come across in every type of facility, whether it's a free facility or an ultra expensive facility or the best clinical based setting in the United States, wherever that is, if you find the perfect program, which doesn't exist by the way, but if you find the perfect program for their needs, you're probably still going to see some resistance. And what that resistance is about is the fear that if they let go of this coping mechanism, these rituals, these self-destructive pathologies, this addiction, that they will be left with no skills, no ability to deal with whatever these underlying issues are. And when you really try to conceptualize this, it doesn't have to be a fantastic diagnosis, right? This doesn't have to be, you could have a 30-year-old individual, 25-year-old individual who you might think is depressed. And they might be depressed. They might have some sort of depressive disordered history. And if they didn't complete college, if they weren't able to get a good job, if they've been consistently self-destructive in their life and in the activities of daily living, their esteem might be completely crushed. And if their esteem is completely crushed, just so you know, that may not seem like a fantastic diagnosis, like really magical diagnosis that like puts the equation A plus B equals C and everything is figured out. But just so you know, low self-esteem can be a crippling condition, right? And the addiction, what it does is it creates a sense of euphoria. The ritual is calming in a way, like for example, eating disordered individuals, the ritual itself is like anxiety reducing, and it sort of attends to this internal turmoil in such a way that it's a coping skill. Now, it's a very self-destructive coping skill, but nonetheless, it's relieving them from pain. It's distracting them from discomfort. So when you see someone resistant to treatment, forget the framework that it comes up in for a second. Forget if you send your loved one to a program and they say, this is nothing like I expected after the intervention. Forget if they say, I don't jive with my counselor or my therapist. Forget if they say, I don't believe what the psychiatrist says, right? The resistance is the fundamental truth of what's going on. And it wouldn't matter whether they jived with their therapist or counselor or whether they agreed with their psychiatrist, they would find another avenue, another outlet for this resistance. And the resistance is to letting go of these coping mechanisms that they have, albeit self-destructive ones. And one of the most important things that you can recognize going into the process of trying to support someone in a treatment setting is to anticipate that resistance is going to come up. And the fabric of the alcoholic, the fabric of the addict, the fabric of the gambler, the emotional makeup, the fabric of who they are is going to be either sophisticated or mundane, right? Like the resistance might come across very mundane. For example, F this program, I hate everyone, right? Or the resistance could be very sophisticated. I spoke with my therapist. She instructed me to do a writing exercise on self-esteem. I think that I have deeper issues of depression, and this program isn't working for me. That's the sophisticated side of resistance. But the reality is that whether it's mundane or sophisticated manipulation, the resistance itself is across the board something that's probably going to come up for you in relationship to your loved one's treatment. And you have to decide beforehand whether or not you believe that. I think I've seen a couple of times, I can't even really recollect one specific example of someone who has gone from an intervention to treatment and been completely comfortable with every aspect of the process. In other words, they've engaged with their therapist, they've participated in the treatment, they love the group process, the community is something they welcome. Very rarely, if ever, have I seen that seamless transition from the point of intervention throughout the entire treatment process. I have seen people with the sophisticated kind of resistance go into treatment knowing that the family, the loved ones, the friends, whomever was involved in that intervention were really serious about being there. I have seen a very sophisticated style of resistance where the addict, the alcoholic, the eating disordered individual, the gambler, the sexual addict, this person goes to treatment and says everything's good, right? And they'll, make their phone calls once or twice a week or once a day, whatever the facility's rules are. They'll call the family, the people that were involved in the intervention. They'll say everything's great, everything's really going well. And then 28-ish days into it or so, when the facility says we think you should do an outpatient program, or we think you should go to an aftercare program, sober living, day patient, any sort of ongoing treatment, all of a sudden the resistance comes up in a different form. And it looks like this. The client will say, oh, no, I've got everything that I need. This intervention was the best thing that happened to me. I really took all the information in. I know how to apply it. I'm done. I don't need any aftercare. I don't need any ongoing accountability or support. I don't need to continue seeing a psychiatrist. Whatever it is, they want to stop it. And, the truth is that after 30 days, coming from an intervention, now, don't get me wrong, 30 days of treatment can be very valuable for someone that is voluntarily admitting. In other words, if I'm going to treatment and I'm not intervened on, and through the process of my addictive pathology, I reach a point of quote-unquote surrender, where I want to surrender these coping mechanisms for something better. And I go to a 30-day treatment center and I investigate my options and I enroll in that program. I'm in a completely different mindset. I didn't require an intervention in order to go to treatment. I voluntarily admitted. So the intervened on individual, that's a little different. They did not go there voluntarily. Ultimately, they made their own decision, but you had to really sort of crowbar them out of wherever they were and insist as a family and as a group that this had gotten so serious that they needed treatment. So when that person goes to the facility, the intervened on person, and says everything's fine, don't fully buy it hook, line, and sinker. In other words, wait to see what happens the second week, the third week, approaching the fourth week, because at the end of the day, the indication that they're internalizing this information is going to be in their willingness to continue to follow suggestions. So we talked about that in the last video. And what we were saying was that recovery is absolutely a treatable condition. The problem is that addictive pathology is so entrenched neurochemically that although you can interrupt the pattern in 30 days, maintenance, some sort of treatment going forward is going to be required in order to understand where the triggers are, to understand where the prelapse areas are, to know how to navigate through life without using and drinking, and more importantly, to know how to navigate through life in a healthy, productive fashion that increases health and vibrance. So, 30 days is not necessarily going to solve a 15-year history of depressive symptoms. And there's going to be ongoing treatment that's required in order for that depression not to resurface in such a way that someone seeks to anesthetize again with substances. Now, it's critical that you understand this. Say your loved one goes to treatment, and over the course of treatment, they interrupt their pattern of consumption. That's a natural byproduct of going to a treatment center. So the safety and the structure, what happens is that the natural byproduct is that they will not be using. And that's a great thing. The pattern is going to be interrupted. However, if they don't consistently comply with whatever their treatment recommendations are, which are going to differ from facility to facility, if they don't comply with those recommendations, the pathology of who they are and how they got here in the first place is sort of waiting outside the door. In other words, when they exit the treatment center, all those old ideas and behaviors and sometimes people and places, we sort of quantify them as triggers, but a lot of people don't fully comprehend the intrinsic nature of a trigger. A trigger doesn't mean that, it does, but it's not necessarily this simple. That an alcoholic leaves a facility, goes to the grocery store to buy, some fruit, and on their way to the fruit aisle, walks by the liquor aisle, sees the liquor, starts drooling, and finds themselves sort of compulsively driven towards the alcohol, and then, buys a bottle and ends up drunk. That's one type of trigger. Another type of trigger, a more complex trigger, the reason that ongoing treatment is so advisable and why you have to watch out for this sophisticated type of resistance is an example. So I've been through over a dozen treatment centers, and I hope that that doesn't happen for you in relationship to your loved one. And quite frankly, that's on me. That has nothing to do with the treatment centers. That has everything to do with my resistance and my unwillingness to engage a process of recovery. However, one of the things that I never fully understood until, this last 15 years where I've been sober, I've been a participant in a recovery process, one of the things that I never understood was the power of old places, old ideas, and old things. And so what I would do is this is what I did prior, I would go to treatment, I would listen even, and participate in the process. But I had a little reservation, and the reservation was that I could stop using drugs but still essentially behave the same way. And I don't mean as deplorably as I might have behaved under the influence of amphetamines or heroin or whatever it was I was using at the time. But that I could, view society in the same way, and I could view my family in the same way, and I could hang out with old friends because they really weren't bad. They had my best interests in mind. And those old beliefs, those old places, those old ideas, are so connected with addiction and addictive pathology and the way that I feel about myself that inevitably whatever I had learned would be eroded, and I would find myself sort of banging my hand on the bar, table, so to speak, drunk. And that is a trigger as well. You know, the inability to separate from old beliefs and ideas and to, you know, sort of fall back into the rut and end up in a similar emotional, spiritual, physical place that requires anesthetization. And once I need an anesthetizer and I consume an anesthetizer, all bets are off. We're done. Just so you know, the treatment has concluded. It is officially starting over. I am back in my addiction. The idea of a slip is a very dangerous concept. And there's a theory that relapse is a part of recovery. And the reality is I disagree with that. I think that relapse is a part of the recovery journey. Meaning, once someone engages the process of recovery, and if you were to look online or read a dictionary and see what recovery says, it's basically a state of remission, right? Where the symptoms of something are removed. And, you know, no matter how you slice that, whether or not you need maintenance to keep those things out of the picture or whether you don't, the truth is that recovery is a state of being removed from certain symptoms that were directly related to a disease, right? And so, you know, it's very important that the first thing that you understand, and I'm trying so hard not to make this go too long, but the first thing that you understand is that resistance is going to come up. And the resistance is something that you have to be prepared for. And I'm going to tell you basically how to prepare for it. You've intervened on this person. So you've gone through this process. You've identified what your emotional state is in relationship to your loved one. You operated from that place in the intervention. You had chosen a facility. So you've made an investigation. You've had an investigation, and you've chosen a facility based on its ability to meet your loved one's needs. So you have two things that are critical that not everybody, not every family, not every loved one in the world has. And that's that you vetted this program. And so the program that they're in, and again, this doesn't mean that they're in our program, but the program that they're in, you trusted with your loved one. And you have to trust the process that's going to unfold for them in order to counterbalance and counteract the resistance. And even if the resistance is sophisticated, you have to have a note of reservation in how you interact and participate with your loved one's treatment. Meaning, if they call you and they say, you know, everything is wonderful, be happy for them. You know, be happy for them. But in the back, you know, in the rear of your subconscious, bring forward to your conscious mind this idea that the other shoe could drop at any time. And they could tell you, I'm not going to follow through on treatment recommendations. I'm leaving the facility. I've done what you asked. And it's just like this switch. And it goes from sounding good to total disease, right? Dis-ease. Like the old mindset will return. So look out for resistance. Be prepared for it. Defer recommendations to the program. Meaning, if the program says they need more care, co-sign it. Acknowledge it. Figure it out with them. You have to probably do another intervention at some point, but the good thing is that the program will do this for you. They just need your support of the recommendations that are being made. So obviously, resistance is something that everyone's going to struggle with. The next layer, which is, you know, also as critical, is going to be denial. And I'm going to talk about denial in just a second. So for right now, what I want you to focus on is this idea of resistance. Be aware of it, be prepared for it. The key to counterbalancing it is to defer recommendations to the treatment setting or the treatment center. So what you want to do is you want to follow the recommendations provided to you by the treatment center. All right? Hope that helped.